Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is now 5:30, and I will call this work session of the Burnsville City Council to order. And for our work sessions, we go directly to the first item that we're going to be addressing. And I just want everyone to know that this meeting is being conducted both in person and online. And the city clerk will note that Councilmember Keeley will be coming in just a little bit. Members of the public may attend in person if they like, or the public can also watch this meeting online at burnsvillemn.gov/meetings or on Comcast Channel 16 or 859, and the public can also participate through Zoom by joining us at zoom.us/join. And more information about our meetings is on the webpage and in the council agenda packet. So the first item on our work session this evening is the legislative agenda, and Fire Chief Vijay Jungmann is presenting. Chief, the floor is yours.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of the council. Thanks for the opportunity to present on the draft 2024 legislative agenda. With us tonight is Ann Lincheski from Lockridge Grindell Nowen, our lobbying firm. She has a whole team of folks that work with her, but we're super happy to have Ann here with us tonight. So I'll spend a couple minutes just kind of going at a high level overview of what we've put together, proposed from a draft legislative agenda for the council to consider. We have three kind of top priorities for the council to consider. As you know, we spent a lot of time in meetings and discussion about the change to Chapter 121 of the statute around school resource officers, and that we wish to have that clarified, particularly around the use of force with our school resource officers, and that would refer back to the 609.06 for any use of force incidents, so that we can train our officers to a single standard of use of force. So we think that that's an important one to get clarity, because we really enjoy our partnership with the school district and want to get our SROs back in the schools and continue to build those relationships formally again. So SRO clarity is one of the priorities. The second one is primary service areas for the ambulance. You've heard me talk about this ad nauseum over the years, but we think it's important that there's some local control of the primary service area laws. Those have not been touched since the early 1980s, and many communities are seeing a change in the service level they're providing, and that affects the whole system. We are fortunate that people years ago chose to have us have our ambulance license, but not every community enjoys that opportunity. We are working with the League of Minnesota Cities, the Fire Chiefs Association, and the Ambulance Association on a task force to try to come up with some common ground on this. But we do think it's important that the legislation gets modernized. The third one is kind of a broad one, but I think it's important to us as a city, is really the local control. As we know, throughout the session, many things come up about what cities are allowed to do and the decisions we're able to make. So making sure that the city continues to be able to make its own decisions that fit our local needs. So we have a few things down here around local option sales tax, franchise fees, other tools that we want to leave up to this elected body to make the decision on. So it's been a broad priority, and we think that that's important to keep our eye on. So those are kind of the top three priorities, and then we go into our supporting positions, where we work with many of our strategic partners on these things, whether it's the League, Metro Cities, Metro Legislative Commission, or others. One of the things that we talk about is the Host Community Economic Development Grant Program. We are the host to a landfill, and we remain supportive in making sure that that grant continues to exist. The aggregate mining fees, because we do host a mine in the city, being able to get the aggregate mining fees. The fourth one is the freeway landfill and dump remediation. Really partnering with the MPCA on this, and to address the environmental challenges. This has been a long-standing issue, and I think it'll be a long-term issue for us to continue to work with the MPCA and the property owner on this, but really a lot of this is between the landowner and the MPCA, and we just know that this is going to be a long-term issue that we want to continue to address. And we really want to make sure that, you know, as that moves forward in the long-term future, we can continue to work on our economic development around that area. And I know if anybody has any questions about that, Ann is here and can shed some light on that as well. And then the last item on the supporting is really franchise fees. There's nothing active with this, but we know every few years,
Yeah.
franchise fees come up in the legislature about
Yeah.
limiting or eliminating. And so just making sure that the legislature is clear that that's a priority to us as a diversified revenue source for us.
Yep.
So those are the supporting positions. And then really we had a couple of funding requests. We have the water treatment plant rehabilitation at $7.75 million over the next 5 years. And we were fortunate to make the House bonding tour on that. And it was great to be able to see the legislators out there and show them the needs that we have at that water treatment plant that provides water not only to Burnsville but to Savage. So it was originally built in 1976, and so after almost 50 years, there's a fair amount of overhaul. And as you know, we have a unique setup with both groundwater and surface water, and so it's important that we rehabilitate that facility. And then lastly is the Highway 13 and Nicollet mobility improvements, and really we have a funding gap of about $52 million. Last year, we were able to get some cash bonds for that from the state to help with the planning, but really we need to close the gap on the construction, and that needs to come from trunk highway funds. We can't get those from GO bonds at this point. So really it's about us working with MnDOT at this point for that, not necessarily the legislature. And that's where Ann and her team, lots of times I think we think about them with working with the legislator, but they're also helpful in navigating the waters with all these agencies. And they have an ability to understand the state system better than we do and help us navigate that, so. With that, I'll stand for any questions, and really the policy question at hand is, does the council support the draft legislative agenda?
Okay. Members of the council, any questions for Chief Jungmann or Mrs. Lancheski on the legislative agenda? If not, I'd like a motion to adopt the legislative agenda.
Move to adopt.
Second?
There's a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. And then the legislative agenda is before us as well. And we have 2 items on the legislative agenda. Any questions? We've been working, you know, the nice thing about all of this, and for our residents who are also listening to this meeting, we work on these things throughout the year, and as you pointed out on some of the items in our legislative agenda, some of this have been repeated. And especially when we look at the public safety, the community safety with the primary service area, that we have been working on, Chief, for many years. So, but it is something that's very important to us. Local control is very important to us. The school resource officers, this is something that nobody knew about, but it did come up at the last session. And so, but it is very much an important area for us to put as a priority. So all of that is great. But members of the council, any questions about this state funding request? If not, I'd like a motion to adopt the state funding request so our staff and our lobbying firm can continue to work on these 2 items.
Move to approve?
There's a motion
Second.
and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay, and the motion carries. Is there any questions from you, Chief, or Mrs. Lancheski? Is there something that you want us to know more about? Any discussions?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, Council. Really great to see all of you. Chief did a great job. You know this, your leadership team and the manager and Chief Jungmann and the team you've assembled are wonderful, and they've had a very thorough process in trying to think through what can be achieved in the next sort of year or 2 at the Capitol. One thing I'd add is we finally learned the Senate bonding dates. If we get a Senate tour, it'll be January 16th, 17th, or 18th. So Senator Port's working very hard to bring the Senate to the water treatment facility. That was a great tour, by the way. The mayor was there. I mean, the staff did a great job. The legislators definitely remember that site after looking at all the sludge and, I mean, painting the picture of the problem, I think was really important. It was a very successful tour, and we heard a lot of comments about it, so that's great. And just thank you so much for the opportunity to get to work with all of you. Really grateful.
And thank you for helping us with the funding gap for Highway 13 and Nicollet, because that's going to be a different navigation to get those funds. We're not going to be testifying in front of the legislature. This time it's about the work that you and our staff do with navigating the MnDOT process.
Right, I think the thing to think about there, as the chief said, you've received what you can in general obligation bonds, and we succeeded last session on that, so kudos to Burnsville on that. So that, your legislators brought that home, the max you could get in that part of the bonding bill. The rest is trunk highway, which is not in the bonding bill, and that means the two transportation chairs have to want to give you an earmark. And at the moment in time that we're in, we have two transportation chairs who are not fans of earmarks, and instead fund MnDOT, and then hope that MnDOT will travel the money along the way. Other parts of the corridor received money, and now you've put that intersection that's so dangerous on the map. I mean, we've gotten the camel's nose under the tent because there was GEO funding in the last bonding bill for that intersection. So now we have the story to tell with the MnDOT commissioner and with all of you, and we'll be doing more of that. Hopefully we can get MnDOT to fund the rest, and if not, we're gonna keep on the legislature, because legislators change, and there's elections, and so there aren't always trifectas, and so earmarks can come back. It's just the timing of who's in charge when, and so we have to look for trunk highway through MnDOT. We have a meeting set up with the governor's office on that soon, and then I think maybe I should also bring up here that, speaking of state agencies, we do recommend, and we've had some strategic advice meetings with the manager and chief, that we'd like to work with the commissioner of the MPCA on landfill issues and think about getting a meeting soon to discuss an update as to where we're at with that, and possibly getting the assistant commissioner back in front of you, if that's something you're open to give you an update since he was here last. I've met with him in between and have done some initial reach out, but looking for direction from Manager Lindberg on that.
Yeah, and I think that would be a good thing to have the Assistant Director from MnDOT to just give us an update to your thoughts. This is a long play, and we have no control over it because it's property owners' rights, and the property owner needs to work with MPCA and the regulations that govern these Superfund sites. And that's where that's at. So, City Manager Lindberg and Chief Jungman, so I'm looking at these transportation funds. Are there opportunities with some of the funding from the federal government on transportation? Is that, and perhaps you have some insight into it as well, Mrs. Linkowski, but City Manager Lindberg?
Long answer short, Mayor. Certainly we'll work with Ann and her team on identifying those opportunities. I do think that there are certainly more opportunities today than perhaps in the past. And with your direction tonight, I think it'll be important for us to continue to work with Ann and her team in terms of advocating with MnDOT for fully funding that project, at least as a first step. I'll turn it to Chief Jungman. Is there anything to add?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, members of the council, we're looking at any avenue to fill the gap there. So, yes, federal funding might be an option, and as you know, we got the Corridors of Commerce grant, and really it's turned into kind of a regional project.
Yep.
Where we're also working with Savage and Scott County and Dakota County on this. So, I know that larger group is working at any avenue they can to fill that gap, and that could be state or federal funds. We just know that being a state highway, we think starting with MnDOT's a great place to start, so.
Yeah, because that bipartisan bill that passed with transportation, there's a lot of opportunities there, and I don't know if we've started to dig into any of that, but there's some opportunities to help us close the gap for Nicollet and Highway 13. So, and and I see Mrs. Lancheski nodding her head, so, and I believe you have a team in Washington who can dig into that as well. So, City Manager Lindberg, it's been adopted that we're going to continue to move forward with the state funding request, so that's work that you and our team work with our lobbyist to get that done. I don't know, anybody have any thoughts? Councilmember Keeley, you're the transportation person, and you've been working on, with the National League on a lot of these areas, so.
Well, I'll try and speak on behalf of the federal money I'm working with. I just sent a copy of this to our Transportation Infrastructure Services Committee Chair, liaison from the
NLC.
NLC, to keep her updated on, we're looking for money in here. And I know in the IIJA federal, there is money for water treatment,
Yeah.
there's money for infrastructure,
Yeah.
these intersections. And so there are, just as a reminder, they're all competitive grants.
Yeah.
And when these grant windows open up, we have to be ready to take
Yeah.
advantage of them and see if we can get something.
And I do know that they have technical assistance
They
at the
do.
federal government,
That-
and we can utilize those technical assistants to help us put together a great grant application.
Absolutely, and the
And
NLC
that's
is
why
offering.
I know that you, Mrs. Lancheski, you have a team that know how to navigate those waters in Washington.
The NLC itself has offered, has all kinds of resources on their website. There's training classes, support
Yeah.
areas,
Yeah.
and I will say that and a few other bills to support transportation, the federal government has put forth more effort to allow smaller cities, we're not necessarily a small city, but smaller cities that don't have grant writing resources, more support and help to get them through that process so they can go direct to the federal government with an application for a grant than probably ever in the history of
Yeah.
the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So the resources are there like never before to help us get there.
Well, between what you're doing at NLC and what I'm doing at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, there's a lot of technical assistance that
Yes.
can help our staff. City Manager Lindberg.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. To the conversation, staff is certainly aware and has been participating in many different assistance initiatives, NLC, and locally as we continue to work to advocate for successful grant applications and taking advantage of some of those resources that are available to us. So we'll continue that. We've mentioned a bit that we've been in conversations, certainly with Ann and her team, about how we expand our relationship with LGN and that partnership, and we'll continue to do that. And obviously, BJ has done a phenomenal job volunteering to lead our legislative initiatives and taking the lead on making sure that our staff are well supported and taking advantage of that technical assistance. And we'll keep you updated on that. Certainly your direction here tonight and some of the changes that we've made strategically from a legislative perspective will really help guide the work that we're doing with Ann and her team, particularly at the state level. So looking forward to that. I would be remiss not to recognize the important partnership that Ann and her team have provided to us. We've accomplished a great deal because of the partnership. So thanks to Ann and certainly to you and your foresight in allowing us to continue that partnership. It really has benefited Burnsville greatly. So thank you.
Yeah. And I want to thank you, Chief. You've been really at the forefront of our legislative agenda and being that liaison for us. And thank you to you, City Manager Lindberg, and your leadership in all of this, and the great partnership with Mrs. Lancheski and her team. So
Mayor,
tonight you received, unanimous approval on both the legislative agenda and the state funding request, so.
I would just add, Mayor, that you make a great point. As a strengths-based organization, we're always looking for opportunities to leverage the talents of our people, and the legislative work that BJ has done is a continuation of the advocacy and the champion that he's been, certainly in the fire service on the legislative side. So he's really used those skills to the benefit of our organization and our position, and I'm grateful for that as well.
Okay. Chief, do you have any other information? Because
No,
you,
Madam Mayor.
you got unanimous vote on both, so you now go to work.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, we got the direction we needed. We appreciate the direction and the support, and we look forward to continuing to work with LGN to accomplish our agenda and move our agenda forward. So
Yeah.
looking forward to good
Yeah.
legislative session, and we're fortunate to have legislators that are local state legislators that are interested in our issues and supporting Burnsville, and we look forward to working with them again, so.
Yep. So, when, do you know when we're going to have that meeting with our legislators? Is that in January?
It's a great question, Mayor. We are tentatively scheduled for the January 9th meeting. However, the last conversation that I had had with BJ and our team, it appears that Egan might also have plans to be meeting with their legislative delegation that evening. So we're making sure that we provide an opportunity in our schedule to allow our entire delegation to participate. So tentatively January 9th, but I'll confirm with the council once we know that the schedule will work.
All right. And then we also need to see how many of our legislators can join us.
Correct. So it's our goal to create an opportunity where they all can choose to join us.
Yeah.
Mayor, you and I talked with Commissioner Workman
Yeah.
earlier this week. She's been invited as well. So we want to make sure that it's a
Yeah.
open roundtable discussion about the things that are important to us.
Well, and it's good for her to know what our legislative agenda is, so she can help us advocate at the county level as well.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, with that, I thank you, and thank you, Mrs. Lancheski. So I'm going to now recess the Burnsville work session. And then at 6 o'clock, I will convene the Burnsville City Council special session so that we can address the budget and levy. So we stand at recess with the work session. Good evening, everyone. I will now reconvene the Burnsville City Council work session. And the second item on the agenda is the municipal facilities pre-design project financing. City Manager Lindberg, you want to make some opening remarks and then send it over to whomever is going to be giving the rest of the presentation.
Absolutely. Madam Mayor, members of the council, thank you very much. Tonight is a continuation of our discussion in the October work session, where staff had presented to you the results of our municipal facilities pre-design project. It's a project that the council had directed staff in July of 2022 to undertake. So about 14 months later, we have identified the space needs and how we might take 3 projects, police and city hall, fire station number 2, and the maintenance facility, and apply the same type of do-it-right standards that we did with our previous project, fire station number 1. In that, staff's been working diligently to also path some potential funding options should the council choose to move any of the pre-design projects forward. Garrett will talk about this a bit by way of introduction to the presentation. The next step in our typical facilities project would be to take a project into design development, and that will be part of the closing questions that I'll have for the council tonight, if you're interested in moving a project forward, and then also getting your feedback, if so, on what funding alternative you might be interested in pursuing, excuse me. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Garrett Beck, our Parks, Recreation, and Facilities Director. Garrett's going to just take us through a brief summary of where we've been through the pre-design process, just a reminder of the October 10th work session conversation. And then from there, Dan Tittner, our municipal advisor with Ellers, will present the analysis that staff in our finance department has been working with them on in terms of potential funding alternatives should the council choose to move any particular project forward. I'd remind the council, and for the benefit of the community, 2 things. First, we do have a landing page for these projects, burnsvillemn.gov/facility-pre-design. I think we're going to improve the link on that one because that was a mouthful. But that is available both for you and for the community, all of the discussion and content that we'll talk about tonight. Secondly, these long-term financial plans and alternatives that we'll present tonight are just that. They're a plan, a snapshot in time, and we've made some general assumptions in putting those plans together. So Dan will walk through both those assumptions and advantages and disadvantages to the particular alternatives that we'll be presenting. So with that, I will turn it over to Garrett to introduce the presentation this evening.
Thank you, Greg. Good evening, Madam Mayor and Council. We'll jump right in. So through our municipal facility projects over the years, we have learned the value of having good guiding principles and having a solid process that helps guide us on how we deliver excellent facilities to our community. As we jump into our guiding principles, they're really a fundamental part of the work that we do. They reflect our strategic priorities. They inform our project team and our consultants on how we go about making design decisions. And is this okay? And if we encounter challenges along the way and our guiding principles are conflicting in any way, that's a great signal for us to re-engage council, to talk about what those challenges are, seek clarity, get direction, and then figure out how best to move forward. So, again, those eight, as we look at our facility design work and how we go about creating great experiences for our community and for staff, and create environments that help us serve the community well, these 8 principles have really guided our work. We want spaces that are welcoming to our community. We want our workspaces to be efficient and effective in providing service to the community. We want them to be functional and flexible to allow us to adjust to changes in the needs of the community and how we deliver those services. We want our spaces to focus on well-being, to be safe and secure, to be sustainable and fiscally responsible. And then ultimately, we want to share this information with clarity with council and with the community, and engage our stakeholders along the way. The second part of the process is really making sure that we have a solid process on how we deliver projects. To date, we've identified the needs for a project, and we've taken a do-it-right approach to that process. We've engaged great team partners with CNH Architect and Carl Sanderson, who are here with us this evening as well. And we've completed our pre-design work to date. So as Greg mentioned, any future decision, next steps, et cetera, on any project would, the next step would really be to enter into a full-scale design of a particular project, would then go out to bid, and then look to break ground and do construction on a project that was ordered. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dan, who will talk about the financing on how something like that might occur.
Well, thank you, Madam Mayor, City Manager Lindberg, and members of the council. This evening, I will walk through a handful. Oop, did I skip? Get up a little. There we go. Does not want to cooperate.
Does it go over here?
Oh, okay. Gotcha. I can do it. It's like raise it. So a few things to kind of begin with the goals for the work session this evening, as we kind of touched on. We're going to review some financial projections that have been prepared really over the past few months in earnest with the city's financial staff and the city manager, and then ultimately with the executive committee for the projects themselves. We'll talk about the impact that those financial assumptions and these projects would have on property owners, both from a franchise fee perspective and also a property tax perspective. And then additionally, we'll discuss the impact that the particular financing methods may have on really the 2 funds that are affected by the financing strategy, the general and the facilities fund. And then, as mentioned, we'll look to the council to provide some feedback on preferred options among the 3 funding alternatives that we'll present this evening. And then, of course, as Garrett and the city manager mentioned, consider and provide guidance on the project timeline moving forward. And then ultimately, after we determine those next steps on both project development and funding strategy, we would have the opportunity to come back in the future and talk to you a little bit more about the specifics of the financing component that's ultimately selected by the council, or among the options, if you ask for more information, come back and provide that at some time in the future. So a little bit about the assumptions that are worked into the model, something that you probably heard me say a few times, if I'm sure about anything when it comes to long-term projections, is that they're wrong. I would be surprised if we all wake up 10, 11 years from now and we have it down to the penny that we're describing this evening. But I think it's important to note what we're really trying to do when we put together a long-term financial analysis is we're taking these individual projects, police and city hall, fire station number 2, and the maintenance facilities, and we're really trying to build them into a cohesive plan and model that both funds the projects in the fiscally responsible way described in the guiding principles, but then also meets the council's goal and really your expectation that the financial position of the city is well protected as you engage in very large capital outlays related to these projects. So our costs generally are based on the pre-design information that has been provided by the architects, engineers, and construction managers. We have at this point in time, for the purposes of the analysis, assumed a 4-year interval between the projects. One thing that's worth noting, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is the way the model has been put together, it does protect the council's ability, both this current council and future councils, when those projects in later years come up, to make decisions about individual projects and provide them with maximum flexibility in deciding when to move forward and in what amounts. So we have tried to keep balances at a certain level in order to protect the council's decision-making prerogative as you move through the process, understanding that ultimately this could unfold over a series of 10 to 11 years. So we are trying to make sure that we're being sensitive to that timeline and understanding that even little degrees of difference that we make now can really have quite a big trajectory when we look out years into the future. We have assumed that debt service will start the year after construction begins. So for example, if construction begins in '25, the first debt service payment would be due in '26. We've assumed 4% annual inflation consistent with the estimates that were prepared as part of the pre-design process. And it's also worth noting that this analysis does not include any potential projects as a result of other studies. But again, as I mentioned, we've built in some flexibility to make sure when you do get new information over the next 10 years, you have the opportunity to pivot and still use the resources of the city and finance other projects if needed. So as mentioned, the pre-design and provided in-depth review and analysis of police and city hall, the maintenance facility, as well as fire station number 2, in-depth analysis of the site constraints, and of course, as discussed before, really the desire to do the projects right and make sure that they're being designed on a time horizon that really provides flexibility moving forward and meets the needs of the city. Both as we discussed last year in the budget process with the additional FTEs, we would imagine that more space will be needed, and so the facilities have been designed with that in mind. I'm assuming since they didn't chime in, I described the pre-design process okay. All right. Now we can turn to the fun stuff, the Facilities Capital Project Fund. So the council is well aware, and many people around the table, of course, are well aware that there are 3 major projects that are being contemplated in the projection period. A city hall and police project, currently estimated at $97 million. Fire station number 2, estimated at $30 million in 2029. And the maintenance facility estimated at $77 million in 2033. In order to prepare the council for a discussion regarding the financing of the projects, we have prepared 3 different options to fund the projects. The first would be a financing solution that would be supported entirely by franchise fee. That's option A. Option B would be another financing solution, so issuing debt supported entirely by property taxes. And then you may see this one coming, but we got really scientific and decided to do option C, 50% franchise fees and 50% property taxes. So really what you can see is we're trying to basically describe to the council the bookends that would happen in the financial analysis and then just something in the middle so you have a sense of the spectrum of financing options currently available to the council and consistent with the current policy as it relates to franchise fees and the more typical way that a city may finance these projects through property taxes. So with option A, we have assumed generally that these projects would be financed through primarily issuing bonds. We've done that for 2 reasons. One, it makes it easier to compare the scenarios across alternatives when we assume kind of the maximum bonding amount. It also provides for a more to use Greg's phrase, a small c conservative model. So we're, again, preserving that flexibility, making sure that we're being appropriately conservative and that the council has a good sense of what the maximum costs would be, quote unquote, when it relates to the various financing options. So as you can see on the slide here, $100 million for Police City Hall, bonding $30 million for Fire Station number 2, and then ultimately $80 million for the maintenance facility out in 2033. So when we look specifically at franchise fees, as you can see here for police and city hall in 2026, the increase that would be required for residential franchise fees, and it's worth noting there are other classes of franchise fees, and if the council were to select the franchise fee option, a future discussion we imagine having with the council would be a more thorough discussion of the various classes and rates and how those individual classes and rates could be changed to meet the financing needs of the organization. Jenny and I have actually joked something like a little mini utility rate study to make sure that we are sizing those rates appropriately over the planning period. But as you can see here, generally just over $115 in 2026 for police and city hall, $65.50 approximately in 2030 for fire station number 2, and then all the way out in 2034 would be the first year that debt service would come online for the maintenance facility the year after construction began, and almost $102 increase in residential franchise fees. It's worth noting that our model at this point in time assumes that there would be no fee increases until 2026, and we make very minor adjustments in the interim years between the projects. Generally, so the council could have the best understanding of the impacts that would happen, we've essentially assumed that the debt comes on in total, and then the fee or property tax increase that would be required to support it comes on in total in the following years. It's worth noting that in a future analysis, we could definitely smooth or fiddle with how those franchise fees are implemented over time, but constructing the model in this way provides the starkest contrast and then makes for the easiest comparison. So at some point in time in the future, if the council were to select option A, we could definitely fiddle with how those franchise fees came online, but right now we've just assumed what I would imagine to be larger than typical jumps in those individual years, just so you can see kind of the maximum impact. The other thing that we've done too, we have compiled estimates of residential growth really through 2027. So we are modeling about an additional 1,150 units of housing between 2023 and 2027. So that's also included. But it's worth noting that even those additional units weighed against the number of households that are in the community doesn't necessarily move the needle a whole lot in terms of the total franchise fees that would be raised in a given year, but it is important to include them so we have a good approximation of what adjustments would have to happen over time. So as you can see here in option A, we've modeled out to 2034. Ultimately, at the end of 2034, the model would have about $24.28 million available. And it would have a fund balance requirement of about $18.7 million. Those seem like very large numbers, but ultimately when you start financing the projects through franchise fees, we have to adjust the fund balance requirements that are in the fund. Consistent with your other capital project funds, we have been modeling a 35% rolling average of the capital outlay. So we're making sure that the fund has enough money year over year to fund its regular operations. But we have also assumed that the fund would be required to hold in reserve 1 year of debt service payments. So as you bring on those additional debt service payments in the facilities fund to support the 3 major projects through 2034, your debt service requirement actually increases to about $18.7 million to make sure you have enough money to cash flow your typical capital projects, and if anything were to happen to your revenue source with respect to franchise fees, you would have 1 year of debt service available to make payments and give the council the opportunity to pivot and make different choices if that were ever to happen. This approach is very typical to what we see and we use in enterprise funds when those enterprise funds like your water and sanitary sewer enterprises have to finance their debt. So we've taken a very similar approach here. The one thing to keep in mind is that really at the end of the planning period between the debt service requirement and the available fund balance, there is a gap of about $5.5 million. In each of the models, we have assumed, I would say, in some cases, a relatively small gap or even a larger gap. And this is primarily because the ordinance for the facilities fund specifically says that when the city prepares a long-term financial plan, it should include enough space in the fund balance to allow for flexibility related to unanticipated projects. So when we look through these, you'll see there's always a considerable gap between the fund balance that's available and the fund balance requirement, because as we model out over 11 years, we do want to make sure that the city has enough space to pivot and do so in a reasonable time frame and in a financially responsible manner. So when we look at franchise fees, there are of course advantages and disadvantages to each of the financing models. Perhaps the main advantage of the franchise fee, as the council knows, is that if the council were to opt to finance the projects in this manner, it would be consistent with your existing recent policy on financing improvements related to facilities. So you currently have in the facilities fund debt service that is supported by franchise fees, that has supported previous improvements to facilities in the community. So in that way, there would be consistency with your previous debt issues and the debt issues moving forward. As the council is aware, the franchise fees also capture tax-exempt properties. When we talk about property taxes, there are a number of exempt properties that do not pay property taxes. So if you were to finance the facilities through property taxes, you would have properties in the community that would realize the benefit of having a new city hall, new police station, new fire station number 2, and of course a new maintenance facility in the 10-year planning window, but they actually wouldn't pay anything related to the construction of those facilities, and in many cases, unless they procure services directly, nothing related to the operation or deferred maintenance related to those facilities. So in this way, you essentially broaden the tax base, and the folks that receive benefits would then ultimately be paying for the facilities themselves. As you'll see in a few slides here, it has the lowest overall cost per payer based on our assumptions. That's something of a tricky statement to make, but just generally it's a little lower because you're broadening the tax base. And you'll see that the property taxes ends up being the highest one because that's a narrower tax base. And it satisfies fund balance requirements for both the facilities fund and the general fund. That's not necessarily true of a couple of the other options, and we'll talk about why that is in a second, but it's a very important advantage of the option number A for franchise fees, because it does really make sure that the financial position of the organization remains protected. As I mentioned, there are, of course, disadvantages to each of the financing strategies. Perhaps first and foremost, when it comes to franchise fees, is they tend to be more regressive than property taxes, meaning that lower income folks will pay a larger percentage of their income on the franchise fee. When you use property taxes, as you're aware, there are a number of programs and sliding scales, like the homestead residential exclusion, which does then allow people to pay less on property that doesn't have as high of a value, and presumably if they have less property, they have less ability to pay, and so their property tax payments are adjusted accordingly. So that's just something to keep in mind when you consider franchise fees versus property taxes. It's worth noting we've done I will say some preliminary comparative analysis, and if the council were to move forward with the franchise fee option, we would provide you with more information with regard to your peers, but at this point in time, it would appear that you would likely have higher franchise fees than the communities you typically identify as your peers, so that's something to keep in mind. You'd be moving from kind of middle of the pack to, depending on the class, kind of first, second, or third, depending on how the fees are ultimately structured. And much like as I already alluded to with the property taxes themselves, franchise fees do not have any what we call circuit breaker programs. So at the state level, if you have higher property tax increases, you can actually take advantage of a special property tax refund. If you have a net increase of more than 6% or $100, you can get some of that money back in a given year. And there's also a regular refund program that's means tested, meaning it's based on your income, and you can file a return with the state and they will refund a certain amount of your property taxes. So in the franchise fee option, no such programs exist, and so there would be no kind of state administrative relief for any increase in franchise fees. So it's just something to keep in mind. So option B, if we were to move into 100% property taxes, you may notice that the bonding amounts are a little less than what was outlined in option A, and this is primarily because when you push all of the debt service onto the debt service levy, you actually have more franchise fees flowing into the fund than are what are currently needed. So you can actually use some of those reserves to reduce the amount that the city would bond for in a given year for those projects. So right now, we have modeled $7 million less for Police City Hall, $4 million less for Fire Station Number 2, and $3 million less for the maintenance facility. So basically about $14 million less than the city would have to bond for. You would still have to use cash. Of course, the projects themselves aren't getting cheaper, but you wouldn't have to borrow as much money because you would have excess revenues flowing into the facilities fund. So right now, under this model, we are assuming a median valued home at $344,400. It's modeled on the previous year's amounts. In a future presentation, we could certainly update that, but this was the information that was available at the time for our projection. As you can see, in 2026, for the City Hall Police project, we would see an increase in property taxes of about $244 to support debt service. In 2030, for Fire Station Number 2, about $71, and then in 2034, the first year of debt service after the city were to commence construction on the maintenance facility, you'd have an increase of about $215. One thing to keep in mind, and this is a question that I think very astutely Jenny and Greg asked, when you look at the numbers, you may ask yourself, well, why in 2034 is a project that is less than the project in 2026 cost almost about the same amount? And that's for two reasons. One, the inflationary pressure that exists on the projects generally. And then two, we have modeled all of the other projects that the city would have to accomplish that are regularly supported by the fund, which works out to about an average of $3.4 million per year in just other stuff that Garrett and his team and Public Works have to build and maintain. And so we've included that as well. And so that's also captured in the model, because the one thing we were very sensitive to do is not mortgage the taxes or franchise fees by pulling money away from other projects to then finance new projects, and then at some point in time in the future coming back to the council and saying, oh, by the way, we need more money because the other stuff that we built we can't maintain now because we've directed all the resources to debt service, so you have to entertain other increases for other purposes. And so again, reaching back to my earlier comment, we wanted to make sure that the council had as much flexibility as possible to maintain the things that you've already built while financing the new facilities that meet the strategic vision and guiding principles that you've established for all of your public needs. So right now, we've assumed no changes in franchise fees under this model. Again, you could increase them annually if you were so inclined, but for purposes of comparison, we didn't adjust them. And the other thing that we have done is we have assumed that the non-binding property tax increases that were established by the council last year still remain in force and effect. And that does create some challenges on the general fund side, which I'll talk about in just another couple slides here. So as you can see in this model, the fund balances are a little inconsistent, and that's primarily because as you build reserves, you would then use some of those reserves to buy down the cost of the debt service, which is why you see kind of the cyclical pattern in the fund itself. So essentially there's a period of savings followed by a period of spending as you use your reserves to buy down the cost of the debt, and then another period of saving, and then a period of spending as you then move into doing Fire Station 2, and then of course the maintenance facility in 2033 and 2034. In this scenario, the fund balance requirement, since the debt service is reduced, since it's not being supported by the fund, ends up being right around $2.25 million. And at the end of 2034, we can see right now we're estimating about a $12 million fund balance. So there's a much wider gap in this fund. About $10 million would be the difference at this point in time. So there is potential under this scenario that if the council were to opt for it, you would have larger reserves in this fund that you could potentially then use to buy down that debt service even more if you were so inclined. We haven't made those assumptions right now. We would imagine, much like we've talked about, since these are individual projects, the council would make choices about exactly how much fund balance to spend when the debt was issued. You would go through a separate process to talk about what was appropriate at that time. But for modeling purposes here, we have reduced it just because the balances were getting considerably higher if we didn't reduce the debt service, and that would result in property taxes that would have to be artificially high. under this scenario. So the advantages and disadvantages of property taxes, as you might imagine, they're kind of the inverse of some of the things that I discussed with franchise fees. The property taxes are more progressive than the franchise fees. There is quite a complicated property tax regimen here in Minnesota. I used to work for a former commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Revenue, and he would always joke that Minnesota property taxes are the most complicated in the union. If you can do property taxes here, you can do them anywhere. So, but that's something to keep in mind between the exclusions and the refunds. They are just more progressive. Folks that do have less to pay generally can get some relief from their property tax bills. There is the potential to reduce borrowing, as I've described. It's already modeled in the fund a bit, but potentially the council could make a more aggressive stride in that regard by using more fund balances. It does satisfy the facilities fund balances, as we talked about on the previous slide. And then, as I mentioned, there are those state property tax relief possibilities. Of course, the council knows that this approach would be inconsistent with how the council has opted to fund facilities projects in the recent past. It doesn't capture those tax-exempt properties, so the folks that would receive the benefit of having the new city hall, police station, fire station number 2, and maintenance facility would not necessarily have to pay for it. As you can see, based on our analysis and the assumptions, it's the highest cost on a per-payer basis of the 3 options. And unfortunately for this one, and I guess I use that word literally in this sense, it creates significant general fund balance challenges. So the council does have the policy established with the adoption of the previous property tax levy of having non-binding levy increases year over year through 2026. We have modeled those as a part of this process. If those caps were to remain in place and the city were to use property taxes to support the debt service, the only thing it could do then at that point to finance the debt would be to pull money from your reserves to make those payments. So in that situation, when the first debt service payment comes online, the general fund balance actually dips to about 27% of the subsequent year's expenditures. And to put that into perspective, the council's policy is to maintain those balances between 40 and 50% of next year's expenditures, with really the goal of maintaining them at 45%. And so this would be a significant deviation from the council's current practice and policy. It would also be from our position, a relatively weak financial position for the city to be in. So it's not to say that property taxes couldn't be used, but when we model the current policy decision by the council, there would likely have to be a pivot in that area in order to support the financial position of the city. So not necessarily a recommendation one way or the other on what to do, except to say that if you were to opt for this, we would have to consider lifting those caps in order to protect the financial position of the city and also the credit rating of the city. If you were to degrade your balances by that much, I would imagine that the city would be downgraded when you went to the capital markets to issue the debt. So something to keep in mind there. So option C, the 50-50 combination. Much like option A, we've assumed the same amount of debt being issued, $100 million, $30 million, and $80 million respectively for each of the projects. And I think unsurprisingly, as you might guess, the amounts are somewhere in the middle between the property taxes and the franchise fees. So right now in 2026 for police and city hall, it'd be about $179 in that year, followed by $70 and about 28 cents in for fire station number 2 in 2030, and then finally the maintenance facility just over $153 in 2034. Once again, we've assumed a median valued home of $344,000. We've also held the assumptions constant for franchise fees, so no increases until 2026, but then 3% increases in those interim years, and we've also modeled in the additional residential growth. And this option, much like the previous option, still includes those caps as it relates to the levy increases year over year through 2026. So when we look at this model in particular, as you can see, once again, the the fund balance requirements increase quite a bit because of the debt service. So at the end of 2034, we would imagine the fund having about a requirement of about $10.5 million. But you would end the projection period with about $20.3 million, so a gap of approximately $10 million. Again, ample space over time for the council to absorb any unknown unknowns or unanticipated projects or emergencies or even shift in council policy or procedures as it relates to facilities themselves. So once again, in this model, there could be an opportunity for the council to use additional debt service to buy down, additional fund balance to buy down the cost of the debt on the projects. But right now, we haven't made those assumptions. Again, just to make it easier to compare across the three alternatives. So when we look at advantages and disadvantages, it does allow for a balance between the two alternatives. So you have the general fund contributing and the facilities fund contributing. You are pulling from those different tax bases. It does satisfy, as the slide represents, the facility fund balance requirements, and it still allows folks to take advantage of those state property tax release possibilities, but not necessarily in the same amount, since 50% of the costs would be funded by franchise fees, and those would be exempt from those programs. It would still be inconsistent with city policies as a disadvantage because you'd still be financing a portion of the project without using franchise fees. It certainly limits the ability to capture those tax exempt properties. And interestingly enough, as the city manager pointed out, we were having a discussion about this, it may also create a criticism of the process in that the folks that are paying franchise fees are also paying taxes, so they're essentially paying twice for the projects, while the folks that just pay the franchise fees and don't pay taxes are only paying once. It does create, and this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but on the previous slide you may recall that option B created significant challenges. This one just creates challenges for the general fund. It does dip to about 38% in that first year of debt service. So again, those non-binding property tax increases on the year-over-year changes would create challenges for the city's financial position. And this may be the most unsophisticated critique of option C, but really it's just the most complicated of all of them. It's the most difficult to explain. It has the most moving parts. And in other communities, when we work with them and they opt for some of these bifurcated financing strategies, it tends just to create consternation because people don't really understand how things are being financed, and it's more difficult for them to estimate exactly how much it will cost them. So it's just something to keep in mind. Not to say that it can't be done, but you just probably would have some more splaining to do when the time came. Third time the charm. All right. So the one thing to keep in mind is that as we talk about these projects over a 10 or 11-year period, it's easy to think about them as an entire program, but really they are individual, discrete projects that are all unique and complicated in their own right, and we're really trying to describe how to finance them over time. And it's possible that the council could opt for one option today and a different option in the future, or the timeline could change, or the project scope could change. And so what we really wanted to make sure that folks had a nice understanding of is what these financing strategies mean for each of the individual projects. So as you can see for Police City Hall under option A, really the total impact would be about $115 in that first year, or an increase in the franchise fees of about $9.60 per month. When you look at option B, you'd have a total impact of about $244 on a median valued residential homestead, and that would be a property tax increase of just over $20 per month. And when you move into option C, you can see right in between the two of them about $180, about $4 a month increase in the franchise fees, or just under $11 in an increase in property taxes. When we look at fire station number 2, a very similar story, but just slightly different amounts since the project is not nearly as expensive. I mean, I think when I've joked with Greg a few times when we're talking about this, we talk about some of these projects just juxtaposed against one another, like, oh, that one's $100 million, that one's only $30 million, but still a huge project by any stretch of the imagination. So forgive any of the onlys or justs if they slip in there. But under option A, you'd have a total impact of about $65.50, or about $5.50 per month for franchise fees. Under option B, to use property taxes, $71 a year, or right around $6 per month. And then in option C, kind of in between there, $70.28. Again, about $2.40 a month in franchise fees, and just about $1 more than that per month on the property tax front. And then moving into the maintenance facility, as you can see, assuming that $80 million bonding under option A, about $101.50 for the franchise fees, or almost $8.50 per month for option B. We do have that reduced borrowing at $77 million, so then you see $215 in a year for property taxes, or right around $18 a month. And then option C, you would have about $153, and then you can see about $350 per month in franchise fees, and then $9.25 per month for property taxes. So if you're adding all that up at home, what you can see here, that basically under option A, about $300 for all of the projects in franchise fee impacts. Under option B, about $500 in property tax impacts. And under option C, about $400 in the combination between the property taxes and the franchise fees. It's worth noting that, this slide does describe the impacts generally over time, but I wouldn't get too enamored with the rolled up costs because, as I mentioned, the council is going to make individual decisions on each of these projects as you move forward, and the amounts will change, the projects will change, the timing may change. And so this is the best guess with the information that we have today. But I just do really want to be sensitive to the fact that we are looking out over a 10 to 11 year horizon. And I don't want to get wrapped up in the idea that it's an all or nothing proposition between these three projects or not at all. Oop. There we go. And with that, I will turn it back to the city manager.
Thanks, Dan. So for your policy discussion tonight, Madam Mayor, members of the council, really two questions for you. First, would you like to move project or projects forward into the design phase of the facilities process, as we've discussed? And then second, if so, what are your funding option or alternative preferences between the three scenarios that we've discussed tonight? Funding facilities based on our current policy with franchise fees, the potential of funding facilities projects completely with the property tax levy, or the third alternative, a combination thereof. And with that, I will turn it to you for your discussion.
Thank you. Councilmember Gustafson.
So, the questions, so I get it right again, there's a policy question about, do we like to move forward, and should we move forward, what are the funding options we're gonna use? We're not funding it tonight, we're not making that vote, we're just saying, should we go forward with this? This is the options that we'd like.
And also the
correct.
priority.
Right.
Correct, Councilmember Gustafson, Madam
Yeah.
Mayor, members of the council. I think it's important to note that should we move projects forward, one of the next most immediate steps we would need to take is to further vet the funding alternatives that we've presented tonight. Again, by way of reminder, this was a very high-level analysis and assessment. And before we invested more with our partners at Ellers and from a staff time perspective, I think it's important to get that direction so we can narrow down the further analysis and assessment that we would need to do from a funding perspective to come back to you for further discussion.
Okay. Yeah, Councilmember Workman.
I've got a few questions I wrote down while Dan was talking. So I'll start with the easy one. Are we able to redirect the current AIM Center payments into this funding program once that loan has been satisfied?
Madam
that
Mayor,
be
members of the council,
a combo?
the short answer is yes. And the current level of analysis and assessment doesn't include the reality that AIM Center
rolling.
debt service will come off of your financial obligations. And with that, I certainly will turn it to Jenny to be more specific than that, if anything.
Yeah, so once, we definitely are prepared to do further analysis, and especially that debt wrapping and what other debt might be
Yeah.
coming off in
And
terms
that's-
of during this time. We know we have other facilities projects that have facilities fund.
Jenny, when
Debt
is
service.
it that AIM Center comes off? The debt service rolls off?
I believe 2027.
Seven.
Yeah,
Is
that's
when
what was
that
in
is
my
the
head,
final year of payment.
2027.
But we do have, 2 other facilities projects that have debt service funded within that facilities fund. Certainly, those are, at least one of those is scheduled to be done during this 10-year time window. So certainly, there's further analysis that needs to be done once we have a path, and we would definitely come back to you with those kinds of options and analysis.
Councilmember Workman, just to further explain the level of assessment and assumptions that we've made in the current analysis of these 3 options, we didn't want to start making assumptions about things like future debt service coming off, or debt wrapping, or refinancing of debt until we had a better idea of the council's direction on which alternative you would prefer. Because it will be a fairly in-depth process for us to fully understand that. And it also goes back to the apt point that Dan made in the presentation. The numbers that are before you tonight, these are significant projects and significant investments. They are the small c conservative estimates. It was our intention to put a worst case scenario in front of you, so we can have a kind of apples to apples across the alternative comparison. And then we need to start working on narrowing down what the actual impact will be. So I would suggest that both for the council's discussion and for the community watching at home, what we're trying to do is be kind of equitable in our approach and our assumptions across these alternatives, and then knowing that we need to do much more work to refine, and really the cost to the community should come down in that work as we assess things like debt coming off.
Thank you.
Follow-up question?
I've got a couple more. Is there any pathway, and again, this is probably going to be in the same vein as the question I just asked, because we're really at a summary level, but do we know if there's grants available for this? Is there state funding available for these projects outside of just us standing alone on something like this?
Madam Mayor, members of the council.
City Manager Lindberg.
I'm going to try to answer the question carefully. I don't want to say no. The opportunities are probably limited based on the nature of these projects. And I don't want to say no because we're always going to be very intentional and very thoughtful about pursuing alternative revenues that would help us to meet the long-term needs of the community. It is something that we certainly would pursue as we refined a particular alternative and worked through any particular design or development process for a project. And I want to be honest, both with you and the community, the reality is it might be tough to find, for these types of projects, find alternative sources of revenue.
I guess I'm thinking more like if we incorporated some renewable energy assets, things that are being incentivized right now that could help offset costs. If they're, obviously we haven't explored that because we're in this stage, but, and then my last question.
Councilmember Workman, just to on the particulars on sustainable and renewable energy, those are opportunities that are available, and we certainly would assess kind of the cost benefit using our guiding principles, that idea of being financially responsible. We certainly would pursue those alternatives and cost them against the reality of a project that didn't include some of those things, as an example, should we move a project forward.
Yeah, if it was a self-sufficient building or something like that, but. And then my last question is for Mr. Tietner. The 282.24 that you put up, is that the cumulative of just these 3 projects, or does that include the existing franchise fees that we're already charging?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, Councilmember Workman, so it would be in addition to the franchise fees that are currently being charged.
And I don't recall what that is currently annually.
On a residential basis, it would be $4 per property per utility. So $8.
So just by way of reminder for the community and for the council, we have 2 utilities that we currently charge a fee for. So when Dan says per utility, per fee, residents across the community currently in that residential class pay a $4 franchise fee on their gas utility and a $4 franchise fee on their electric utility. That total annual increase over the 10-year plan and the 3 projects, assuming that we do all of them, would be, to Dan's point, in addition to the annual, the current annual franchise fees.
So that puts us about over $300 a year.
Yeah, so Mr. Mayor, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Workman,
Wrong city.
I go to a few of them.
I know.
That's why I should always just say Your Honor. So at this point in time, really today, we'd be talking about franchise fees across both franchises at $96. They would have to increase under the current assumptions, $282.24 for a total franchise fee annually of $378.24.
What does that work out to per month?
$30 a month.
Oh,
You
I
got
was
the
not
math?
strong math.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I guess I'll just wrap up by saying I'm not super comfortable making any direct decisions tonight with Councilmember Keely gone. If we're gonna make a decision to spend $200 million, I would prefer if all of us were present, but
Okay, I text him,
I know he's got a family emergency right now.
yeah,
so.
and I text him to see where he was at with franchise fees and the priority of police and city hall, and he said yes and yes.
What was the question?
The question was, are you in favor of the franchise fee? That's option A.
Okay.
To fund the project. And the other question was, are you still in favor of priority of police and city hall? And he said yes and yes.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, because I know that he's gone, but we have, his voice is important still, and
Absolutely.
he's been well-informed, like each and every one of us, with all of our check-ins with staff, with the city manager and everyone else, and so he hasn't changed his mind.
Well, and I appreciate his perspective as much as I appreciate all of yours, and so, that's why I mentioned that, so,
Okay.
I'll pause there and let anyone else ask questions if they have any.
Okay. Councilmember Gustafson, you have any thoughts about the design moving forward, the priority and the funding
Well,
mechanism?
I think we've proved out that we certainly need these facilities for the future, and charts you didn't show tonight were the expense of delaying this years down the road, and could get extremely expensive for us, so I would like to see us move forward, at least on getting the design and start looking at what we're looking at here. And I agree that the option A seems to be the right way to go. I would encourage us to look at some other options as well along the way as things pop up, whether it's grants or anything like that. And depends what the state does with certain other things that a city might be able to do to raise funds as well, which they're discussing now, so.
Okay. Councilmember Schultz?
I think I still feel the priority is fire station first. I understand the arguments why that is not so. To me, that is a safety thing that overrides absolutely any other consideration. As for the funding options, the franchise fee is the most transparent to our residents. So option A.
Okay. Option A is the direction that we've talked about, and from my perspective, with everything that I've heard, it means that everybody pays. It's not just only those who are paying the property tax. And it is the funding mechanism that we had decided to put in place for facilities. And from my perspective, when I look at police and city hall, if we don't do it now, we'll never get it done. It'll never get done because the cost will continue to go up. And so it'll never get done. So police and and fire, police and city hall is the priority to move forward. And then, as we have talked about many times, and then fire station 2, and then maintenance. So for me, I would like to direct staff to move forward with design and police and city hall and option A. Councilmember Workman?
I was gonna say, if BJ gets 2 facilities in a row, he's gonna have to start watching his back around here.
I appreciate that.
We're all a team.
Yeah, I appreciate it. That was just for discussion with PJ. That's great. Thanks, guys.
I got your back, BJ.
You got me.
He's got your back, all right.
I've heard that before.
Don't turn it.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Thanks for saying
Watch
something,
it.
because there were so many
Yeah.
things that I wanted to say. and I
Yeah.
just-
Watch it.
Plenty of things not to say.
You're looking for direction. I would agree with Mayor Couts here on this. Let's get more details. Move it forward.
Okay. So I think you have your direction with the redesign and the funding mechanism. I trust that our staff will turn over all opportunities, both from state and federal government, where there may be opportunities that could help defray some of the costs. But option A is the funding mechanism that will allow us to look at bonding. Correct, Dan Tintner?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, so each of the options would allow you to bond.
Yeah.
Option B and option C just have more complicated
Yeah.
policy questions related to the general
Well-
fund balance.
The other thing is that just goes on top of all of the services that we have to provide from the property tax, where option A is a separate funding mechanism, and that'll impact everybody, even the nonprofits.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, yes, that's correct. So the franchise fee is applied to tax exempt properties within the city proper.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, the council has adopted an ordinance that is quite prescriptive about how the facilities fund and the monies therein ought to be used,
Yeah.
mainly to support only facilities, and then there are some other requirements, but
And I would add, Madam Mayor, members of the council, to Councilmember Schultz's point earlier, I do believe, from my perspective, from a staff perspective, that alternative A, franchise fees, number one, it's most consistent with the current policy that the council has
Yeah.
established.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point. I also believe that it is the easiest path for us to start communicating with the community about how we
How
would
it's gonna be
potentially
funded.
invest and fund these particular projects. So I do think that's a important advantage. With your direction tonight, I also think it's important that we come back to you with more detailed analysis. There will be several things in that funding path that we'll need to continue to work through. Dan had mentioned earlier, one of those things that we're going to want to do, certainly as we start to engage the community in talking more about these projects, is also do a very specific rate study from a utility franchise fee perspective to make sure that we understand not only our path forward, but how that interacts with the market and it impacts on different types of ratepayers. So that would be work that we would need to continue to do. Councilmember Workman brought up some good questions earlier about debt service. I would end that debt wrapping and some other considerations that we'll need to start working into that alternative to start refining those numbers and talking more about particular policy direction as it relates to a funding mechanism. And I also heard loud and clear, staff will be abundantly creative and intentional as we think about and gather ideas and pursue alternative revenue sources or alternative sources of funding to ease the potential impact on ratepayers as we move forward.
And one of the things I also talked to staff about is that to invite the rating agencies to come in and have conversation with our staff on what we're doing here. So to be open and transparent with them so they understand the total picture of our debt service, and what debt is going to be rolled off and what is going to be wrapped around. So,
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I think that's an important point. One of
Yeah.
the things that staff would recommend, should we move forward here, and Dan can speak much more articulate to this than I can, but we do have the opportunity to go to the rating agencies ahead of any sort of bond issuance to see what the actual impact from their perspective
Yeah.
would be. Our AAA bond rating is important to us. It's important to the community. That's what our commitment to financial stewardship is all about. So Mayor, I would agree that would be a piece of the additional analysis that we would want to do. I'll let Dan address this specifically. Ellers has kind of reverse engineered for us what they believe the impact to our bond rating would be, and it's positive. We believe that should we move forward with the Police City Hall project and issue that level of debt, that in that area, we would maintain a AAA rating. But I can let Dan address that more if you have anything to add.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, so as the city manager said, one of the things that you can do with S&P, your credit rating agency, is you can essentially engage in voluntary surveillance, and there is a fee for that. We'd have to reach out to them and see what the fee would be. Essentially, what the city would do is supply the financial information that's been provided to date, or if we do the additional utility rate study, depending on the time, we'd give them that information as well. And then the debt plans. And essentially what they do is they put you through essentially a faux credit rating process, and we'll come back and tell you if you were to move forward in a certain path, what their opinion of that would be. As the city manager mentioned, we have at Ellers taken a look at the city's credit rating, and we have taken a look at the profile and added in an additional $100 million of debt. And based on our analysis, we believe that the city would maintain its AAA credit rating. But this is where I'm forced now to say in a public meeting, no disclaimers, warranties. S&P is its own agency and makes its own determinations. So if you wanted absolute certainty, we would recommend that you go through that process. And if the council were so inclined, we could definitely reach out to S&P and get pricing for what that would look like and when they would want to kind of take a peek under the hood.
yeah. One of the things that I was also, in just listening tonight again to Jenny's report, but our market value is like 8 billion, 8 point some billion.
Over 9 billion.
9 billion.
9.6.
So when I look at all of that and you look at the increase, because I know the rating agency's looking to see, what is the full faith in of a community, and is it a community that's thriving and that has the wherewithal to pay its debt? And so when I look at all of that information, it's for them to take a look at that and say, okay, this is a community that's continuing to increase in market value, and it's not declining.
Can I ask one more follow-up?
Yeah, Councilmember
I
Brooke.
know, Dan, you touched on this a little bit, but if the franchise fee is the option, I thought I saw something about a 4% increase. This is something that would be feathered in gradually, not just a sudden uptick. Or I guess what's the thought on that?
Yeah, Councilmember Workman,
Or
members of
Jenny.
the council, the assumption right now in the modeling that we provided is those increases wouldn't be realized until 2026. The council would have the opportunity to potentially start feathering in increases earlier than that, should you choose. I would ask and recommend that that be part of the additional analysis that we do when we come back with some more discussion on those alternatives. And with that, I can turn it to Dan, because I think I cut you off.
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I know that's pretty much exactly what I was going to say, so works for me.
Thanks for understanding.
Okay. So, members of the council, if I'm hearing you correctly, the direction to staff is to move forward. Police and fire, and option A, and then they can now do some deep dive work and come back with more information. Okay? Pardon?
City Hall, you said at least in five.
Oh.
City Hall.
City, correction, City Hall and police. So everybody has fire in their brain.
So, Madam Mayor, members of the council, I certainly hear that direction clearly. Thank you for the clarity. I would say that, first and foremost, this is the culmination of 14 months of a pre-design process, where a lot of work with our partners at CNH and KA.
Can you
and
introduce
staff.
our, so that,
Certainly, Quinn Houston, principal with CNH, and our partners with KA are next to him as well.
give us your name, so,
Yes, my name is Ken Francis with Krause Anderson.
okay,
I missed
JC
that
Rep-
part, sorry.
Nope, you're good.
Jason, sorry.
Jason Remmings here.
okay, very good. We want everybody to know who the whole team is.
Thank you.
So just process-wise, staff will start working into the design process for the Police City Hall project. The next probably discussion from a council perspective will be to further discuss the funding alternative
Yeah.
path that you identified tonight. So we'll keep you updated on that and get those meetings scheduled in the future. I would also add that this would be the point in time, if you're agreeable to it, that I think that it would be important for us to really make a intentional effort to re-communicate with the community and start to engage the community on the needs of these projects and what we're doing and why. So I'll start working with the team to do that as well. And we'll also keep our eye on the longer term horizon in terms of potential future projects and keeping the council informed and discussing those needs as we move into the future as well.
Well, now that you have direction, we can start all of that work.
We will start that work, Madam
Yeah.
Mayor, members of the council.
I got a hunch they're gonna find out on Friday, at least preliminarily.
Indeed.
Just a hunch.
Okay. Are there any other comments or remarks that anyone wants to make? First of all, I want to thank you, Greg, for your leadership, and I look around this room and everybody who has been involved in really looking at our facilities project. And I know that each and every one of you have been very much a part of all of this, and Garrett, for your work on the facilities, and Hugo, on the work that you do in making sure that we're all on track with a lot of this. So thank you to the whole team. And thank you, because I know there's been hours and hours of work that has brought us to this point. And now we're going to do more work. Now it's the deep dive, and everything is on your side of the plate, right, Jenny?
Yes.
To bring back more information. But thank you so much, everyone. If there's no other comments to be made, I'm going to now go to the city council and ask if they have anything for reporting or roundtable.
Not this week.
Okay. Vince?
No, I don't.
Did you say no?
No, I'm good.
Just kidding.
Karen?
I was thinking about going NLC, but
Yeah. I think everyone is tired. I'm good too. Yeah.
I can read the room, nothing from staff, Mayor.
should we FaceTime Councilmember Keeley and see if he wants?
Yeah. Shall I have Councilmember Key? Oh. Okay. Well, with that, thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you for all of your hard work that brought us to this point. Now we move forward with the project, and you have more work to do. Now it's deep dive, more information, but we're moving forward. Okay, thank you, and with that, we stand adjourned by acclamation.